Hello, and welcome back to Bedtime Story. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd love to know where you're listening from. If these stories have become part of your nightly routine, consider leaving a like and subscribing. It really helps the channel. Now get comfortable, settle in, take a deep, calming breath, and let's begin. In this new story, long before paranormal television shows turned abandoned houses into tourist attractions, law enforcement agencies across the United States were already responding to reports involving vacant homes that should have been empty but somehow never stayed that way. Most investigations ended with simple explanations. Teenagers entered abandoned buildings looking for adventure, copper thieves stripped wiring from neglected properties, homeless individuals occasionally sought shelter inside collapsing farmhouses during harsh winters. Those cases were predictable because they always left behind evidence. Forced doors, footprints, fingerprints, discarded food, or signs of recent occupation eventually revealed what had happened. The investigation that began outside the abandoned Ashcroft house in rural Indiana during the autumn of 2018 proved unsettling for an entirely different reason. Every witness insisted someone had been living inside the property. After nearly 3 weeks of investigation, detectives concluded that nobody had. The Ashcroft house stood alone at the end of a narrow county road surrounded by more than 80 acres of overgrown farmland. Built in the late 1940s, the two-story farmhouse had remained vacant for almost 15 years following the death of its last owner. County tax records showed the property had passed through several financial institutions before foreclosure proceedings stalled indefinitely, leaving the house abandoned but legally inaccessible. Neighbors occasionally noticed wildlife entering through broken windows, yet nobody reported seeing vehicles, lights, or people near the property for years. That changed during the first week of October when a rural mail carrier informed county deputies that fresh smoke had been rising from the chimney during several early morning deliveries, despite the house having no active utility connections. Deputies initially assumed squatters had moved into the abandoned structure before colder weather arrived. During their first inspection, however, they found every exterior entrance secured exactly as documented during a previous property assessment conducted months earlier. Windows remained broken in the same locations, doors were still chained from the outside, and thick vegetation surrounding the house showed no obvious paths leading toward the entrance. Curious about the smoke report, investigators walked around the property expecting to smell a recently used fireplace. Instead, they found the chimney cold to the touch, with no ash, soot, or signs that a fire had burned inside for many weeks. The investigation might have ended there had additional reports not begun arriving from unrelated witnesses. Over the following 6 days, a utility contractor, 2 hunters, and a county road maintenance supervisor each contacted the sheriff's office after noticing lights inside the upstairs windows shortly before sunrise. Every witness described a warm yellow glow lasting only a few minutes before disappearing. None reported seeing flashlights moving through the rooms or vehicle headlights approaching the property. The light remained fixed inside the same second-floor bedroom before fading completely. Deputies returned on 3 separate mornings but never observed the illumination themselves. Believing they might be dealing with trespassers entering through an unknown access point, detectives obtained permission to conduct a complete forensic examination of the house. Crime scene technicians photographed every room before collecting fingerprints from stair railings, window frames, and interior door handles. Layers of dust covered nearly every horizontal surface, interrupted only by the tracks left by investigators during the search. The kitchen contained rusted appliances disconnected from plumbing years earlier. Bedrooms remained filled with aging furniture coated in cobwebs. Most strikingly, the fireplace showed no evidence of recent use despite repeated reports of smoke. Laboratory analysis later confirmed that every fingerprint recovered inside belonged either to former property owners documented in historical records or to investigators participating in the current examination. Rather than closing the investigation, detectives installed motion-activated cameras covering every exterior approach to the farmhouse. Additional equipment monitored the interior staircase, main hallway, and second-floor bedroom, where witnesses consistently reported seeing lights. The surveillance system operated continuously for 14 days while investigators checked recordings each morning. The cameras documented deer crossing the fields, raccoons entering through broken basement vents, and strong winds moving loose shutters against the exterior walls. They never recorded a single person entering or leaving the property. Even more puzzling, on the ninth morning of surveillance, one exterior camera briefly captured the upstairs bedroom window glowing with the same warm yellow light described by previous witnesses. Simultaneously, the interior camera facing that room recorded complete darkness. Engineers specializing in electrical systems were asked to determine whether sunlight, distant vehicle headlights, or atmospheric conditions could have created an optical illusion visible from outside but not from within the house. Over several evenings, they recreated traffic patterns, positioned portable lighting at different angles, and measured reflections from surrounding fields. Every experiment produced different results from those documented by investigators. The exterior camera consistently showed a uniform glow confined entirely within the upstairs bedroom window, while no measurable light appeared inside the room itself. The engineering report ultimately concluded that no tested lighting condition successfully reproduced the recorded effect. As the investigation continued, county historians uncovered an unexpected detail unrelated to local ghost stories or folklore. During the 1970s, the Ashcroft House had briefly served as temporary accommodation for survey crews constructing a nearby section of state highway. Maintenance records from that period mentioned recurring complaints about unexplained lights appearing in the upstairs bedroom after electrical service had been disconnected during renovation work. The reference occupied only a single paragraph within hundreds of pages of archived documents, yet investigators noted the remarkable similarity between those observations and the reports received more than 40 years later. Despite that connection, no additional records explained how the earlier incidents had been resolved. Toward the end of October, heavy storms damaged part of the farmhouse roof, making the structure unsafe to enter. County officials ordered the building demolished several months later following an engineering assessment that declared it beyond repair. Before demolition began, investigators conducted one final inspection, hoping structural damage might reveal concealed wiring, hidden rooms, or evidence of long-term occupation previously overlooked. None was found. The upstairs bedroom, where witnesses repeatedly observed lights, contained nothing beyond a collapsed bed frame, peeling wallpaper, and a cracked window overlooking empty fields. No batteries, generators, lanterns, electrical equipment, or hidden access points were discovered anywhere inside the house. The Ashcroft investigation remains archived as a closed, suspicious incident because detectives found no evidence supporting trespassing, fraud, vandalism, or criminal activity. Official reports make no reference to paranormal explanations and carefully avoid speculation beyond documented observations. Yet among the deputies, forensic technicians, and engineers who participated in the case, one question has never received a satisfactory answer. Multiple independent witnesses reported the same unusual light. An exterior surveillance camera eventually documented it. Interior cameras confirmed the room itself remained dark at exactly the same moment. Every practical explanation was tested, measured, and systematically eliminated. When the farmhouse was finally reduced to rubble, the lights disappeared forever, taking their explanation with them and leaving behind one of the most quietly unsettling abandoned house investigations ever recorded. In this new story, few places attract curiosity like an abandoned house standing alone at the end of an overgrown road. To some, they are forgotten pieces of local history. To photographers, they are reminders of communities that slowly disappeared over time. To police officers and firefighters, they are simply dangerous structures waiting to collapse. Yet every so often, investigators respond to one of these forgotten homes, expecting to deal with trespassers or vandalism, only to discover a situation that refuses to follow ordinary logic. One of the most unsettling cases occurred during the spring of 2019 in a remote section of western Pennsylvania, where an abandoned Victorian farmhouse became the focus of an investigation that lasted nearly 2 months. Long after the property was demolished, those who entered the house agreed on one thing. They wished they had turned around before opening the front door. The farmhouse had been built in the early 1900s and overlooked what had once been a thriving coal community. By 2019, nearly every neighboring home had either collapsed or been removed, leaving the property isolated among acres of second-growth forest. County records showed the house had remained vacant for almost 18 years following the death of its final owner. Electricity, water, and natural gas had all been disconnected, while foreclosure proceedings left ownership tied up in legal disputes that prevented redevelopment. Aside from occasional inspections by county officials, nobody was supposed to enter the building. That changed after local hunters began reporting signs that someone was regularly occupying the upstairs rooms despite no vehicles ever being seen nearby. The reports initially seemed routine. Hunters described curtains moving behind broken windows, footsteps echoing across the second floor shortly before sunrise, and fresh tire tracks appearing on the muddy access road before vanishing several hundred yards from the property. Deputies assumed squatters had found a way inside and scheduled a daytime inspection. The search revealed no evidence of recent occupation. Dust covered every floor, bird nests filled several bedrooms, and rainwater had begun rotting portions of the roof. Kitchen cabinets remained empty, fireplaces contained years of accumulated debris, and no food, clothing, bedding, or personal belongings suggested anyone had spent even a single night inside. Investigators documented the property before leaving, convinced the complaints had been exaggerated. 3 evenings later, County Dispatch received another call, this time from a volunteer firefighter returning home after a training exercise. While passing the abandoned farmhouse, he noticed a faint orange glow coming from an upstairs bedroom overlooking the valley. Believing trespassers might have started a fire inside the deteriorating structure, he immediately contacted emergency services. Engine crews arrived within 12 minutes expecting flames or smoke. Instead, they found the building completely dark. Thermal imaging cameras detected no elevated temperatures anywhere inside the house, and firefighters found no evidence that a fire had recently burned. Yet, the responding lieutenant later confirmed that the upstairs window had clearly appeared illuminated while approaching the property from the road. Concerned that someone might be entering and leaving before responders arrived, detectives requested permission to install motion-activated cameras around the exterior. 4 cameras monitored every accessible entrance, while an additional unit overlooked the staircase leading to the second floor. The surveillance system operated continuously for 21 days. During that time, it captured deer, coyotes, raccoons, wild turkeys, and countless smaller animals moving around the abandoned house. It never recorded a single person approaching the property. Nevertheless, dispatch continued receiving occasional reports from passing motorists describing lights in the upstairs bedroom during the early hours before dawn. Investigators eventually decided to remain inside the farmhouse overnight. Shortly before midnight, 2 detectives, a county fire investigator, and a structural engineer entered the building carrying battery-powered lighting, portable radios, and environmental monitoring equipment. Their objective was simple. If someone entered the property, they intended to observe exactly how access had been gained. The first several hours passed without incident. Wind moved through broken windows, loose floorboards creaked under changing temperatures, and wildlife occasionally rustled outside. Everything matched what the investigators expected from an abandoned structure that had stood empty for nearly 2 decades. At approximately 2:43 a.m., one detective noticed an unusual sound coming from the upper hallway. It was not loud enough to identify immediately, but everyone inside heard it at nearly the same moment. The sound resembled the slow movement of wooden furniture being dragged across an old floor. Believing someone had entered through an unseen opening, the investigators climbed the staircase together and searched every room one by one. Each bedroom remained exactly as documented during previous inspections. Layers of dust remained undisturbed, windows were locked from the inside, and no footprints appeared on the floor beyond those made by the investigators themselves. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had begun and never repeated during the remainder of the night. The following morning, technicians downloaded every surveillance recording collected during the overnight operation. The exterior cameras showed no activity around the house. The interior camera, aimed directly at the staircase, revealed the investigators ascending together after hearing the unexplained sound. Nothing unusual appeared before or after that moment. Audio analysis, however, detected the same scraping noise recorded simultaneously by 3 separate body cameras carried by investigators on the second floor. Because the sound originated on independent recording devices positioned in different rooms, forensic analysts concluded it had occurred within the building itself rather than through radio interference or equipment malfunction. Even so, no source could be identified. Several weeks later, engineers determined the deteriorating farmhouse posed an immediate safety risk and recommended demolition. Before heavy machinery arrived, investigators completed one final examination, hoping structural removal might reveal concealed rooms, hidden crawl spaces, or evidence of unauthorized occupation overlooked during earlier searches. They found nothing. Once the building had been reduced to its foundation, the county graded the site and removed the remaining debris. From that day forward, no additional reports of lights, footsteps, or unexplained activity were ever received from the location. The investigation officially closed without identifying trespassers, criminal activity, or a mechanical explanation for the repeated witness reports. Detectives involved in the case have consistently avoided describing the farmhouse as haunted, emphasizing that the evidence never supported such a conclusion. What they do acknowledge is far simpler. Independent witnesses repeatedly described the same upstairs room. Firefighters personally observed a light that left no physical trace. Investigators recorded an unexplained sound inside an otherwise empty structure, while every entrance remained under surveillance. None of those observations proved anything extraordinary, but together they created a case that resisted every ordinary explanation. Years later, among those who walked through the abandoned farmhouse, believing they were about to solve a simple trespassing complaint, the memory that remains strongest is not what they discovered inside. It is the lingering realization that they left with fewer answers than they had when they first stepped through the front door. In this new story, for most Americans, hitchhiking belongs to another era. During the 1960s, 70s, and even into the early 80s, it was common to see travelers standing beside rural highways, carrying backpacks, duffel bags, or cardboard signs listing their destinations. Today, the practice has nearly disappeared, replaced by smartphones, ride-sharing apps, and growing concerns about personal safety. Yet, across Appalachia, where isolated roads still connect hundreds of small communities, sheriff departments continue receiving occasional reports involving hitchhikers whose stories leave investigators with more questions than answers. Some reports involve stranded travelers. Others involve motorists who later insisted they picked up someone who seemed perfectly ordinary until the journey took an unexpected turn. The following case remains one of the strangest ever documented along the back roads of eastern Kentucky. During the final week of October 2017, 49-year-old Daniel Brooks left Pikeville, Kentucky, shortly after sunset following a routine maintenance inspection at a communications tower. Daniel had worked as a field technician for nearly 20 years and often drove remote mountain roads long after dark. Friends described him as practical, patient, and difficult to rattle. His truck contained emergency supplies, extra fuel, recovery equipment, and printed county maps in case his navigation system failed. He had traveled nearly every road in eastern Kentucky and believed there were very few surprises left in the Appalachian Mountains. Around 8:45 that evening, Daniel entered Kentucky Route 80 while taking a shortcut toward Prestonsburg. Traffic was unusually light. During nearly 30 minutes of driving, he encountered only two other vehicles. Autumn leaves covered the shoulders, while patches of low fog settled inside narrow valleys below the highway. The temperature had fallen into the upper 30s, making it unlikely anyone would be walking along such an isolated road. That assumption changed when Daniel rounded a sharp curve and saw a man standing beside an old wooden guardrail illuminated by his headlights. The stranger appeared to be in his late 60s. He wore a faded brown jacket, denim overalls, and carried a small canvas bag over one shoulder. He did not wave frantically or step into the roadway. Instead, he simply raised one hand as Daniel approached. Years working throughout rural Appalachia had taught Daniel that helping stranded travelers was still common in many mountain communities. He slowed, unlocked the passenger door, and asked where the man was headed. The stranger smiled politely before answering, just a little farther down the road. His voice was calm, almost reassuring, with the slow Appalachian accent Daniel had heard throughout his childhood. As they continued driving, the conversation remained surprisingly ordinary. The man introduced himself only as Walter and claimed he had been visiting relatives in a nearby hollow after attending a funeral earlier that afternoon. He spoke about abandoned coal camps, old churches disappearing from the mountains, and how many young people had moved away searching for work. Nothing about the discussion seemed unusual. Daniel later told investigators that Walter sounded exactly like dozens of older residents he had met during years working throughout eastern Kentucky. If anything, he seemed grateful simply to have someone willing to talk during a lonely drive through the mountains. After nearly 15 minutes, Walter pointed toward a narrow gravel road branching away from the highway. There were no reflective signs, no visible houses, and no mailbox identifying the road. Daniel slowed before asking whether anyone actually lived there. Walter quietly nodded and replied, "Used to be a whole community." The answer struck Daniel as oddly phrased. Before he could ask another question, Walter looked toward the dark forest beyond the windshield and added, "Most folks don't stop around here anymore, probably for the best." Daniel offered to drive him farther down the gravel road, but Walter immediately declined. Instead, he asked to be dropped off exactly where the pavement ended. Daniel stopped beside a rusted cattle gate partially hidden beneath vines. Walter thanked him, stepped from the truck, and walked slowly into the darkness carrying the same small canvas bag. Daniel watched through the side mirror until the man disappeared beyond the gate. Satisfied that his passenger had reached home safely, he continued toward Prestonsburg. Less than 5 minutes later, his truck radio suddenly filled with heavy static before clearing on its own. He thought little of it until reaching home later that evening. The following weekend, Daniel mentioned the encounter while working with another technician who had lived in the area his entire life. When he described dropping an older man named Walter near the abandoned gravel road, his coworker became unusually quiet. After several moments, he asked Daniel whether the man had been wearing brown overalls and carrying a faded canvas bag. Daniel answered yes without hesitation. His coworker then explained that the description matched Walter Hensley, a retired coal miner who had died from a heart attack nearly 12 years earlier. At first, Daniel laughed, assuming someone else shared the same name. His coworker insisted there had never been another Walter Hensley living in that hollow. Curiosity eventually led Daniel to the Floyd County Historical Society, where volunteers maintained newspaper archives and cemetery records. They located Walter Hensley's obituary from November 2005. The accompanying photograph showed an older man wearing denim overalls and smiling exactly as Daniel remembered. Even the canvas bag hanging from Walter's shoulder appeared in one family photograph donated decades earlier. According to surviving relatives, the abandoned gravel road once led to a small mining settlement completely abandoned after flooding during the early 1990s. Today, little remained except broken foundations hidden beneath the forest. No permanent residents had lived there for years. Daniel never claimed he had encountered anything supernatural. During interviews, he consistently stated that he believed he had given a ride to a real person, someone with a normal voice, ordinary conversation, and detailed knowledge of the surrounding communities. Yet investigators could not explain how Walter disappeared so quickly after leaving the truck, why no other residents matched the description, or why Daniel accurately described personal details never mentioned until he later viewed the archived obituary. The sheriff's office found no evidence of criminal activity and officially closed the inquiry without further action. Stories like Daniel's continue circulating throughout Appalachia, often dismissed as misunderstandings, mistaken identity, or memories shaped by lonely mountain roads after dark. Most likely, there are perfectly reasonable explanations for every detail. Even so, experienced deputies, volunteer firefighters, and lifelong residents quietly share one piece of advice with newcomers exploring the back roads at night. If you decide to stop for a hitchhiker, pay close attention to where they ask you to let them out. Because sometimes the destination is no longer there, and sometimes the person thanking you for the ride has already been part of Appalachian history for many years. In this new story, on August 9th, 2022, the Tennessee Highway Patrol opened an investigation after receiving 3 unrelated reports involving the same stretch of U.S. play. Highway 421 near the Tennessee-Virginia border. None of the callers reported a collision, a disabled vehicle, or a crime in progress. Instead, each described encountering a dark-colored pickup truck parked along the shoulder shortly after midnight with its headlights switched off. What immediately caught investigators' attention was that every witness provided nearly identical details despite contacting dispatch separately over a period of 45 minutes. By the time the first trooper reached the reported location, the truck had disappeared. At first, investigators assumed the driver had simply continued down the highway. Over the following week, however, evidence began suggesting that the 3 motorists had not witnessed the same event at all, despite believing they had. The investigation centered on a remote section of highway crossing steep Appalachian ridges where cellular reception frequently disappeared for several miles at a time. Although the road remained well-maintained, long curves and heavy tree cover limited visibility after sunset. Traffic volume dropped significantly after 11 o'clock, leaving many drivers traveling alone for extended periods. Highway patrol records showed relatively few serious accidents in the area, making the cluster of nearly identical reports stand out immediately. Detectives began by locating the 3 motorists, all of whom agreed to provide detailed written statements before learning anything about the other reports. The first witness, a traveling nurse returning home after a weekend shift, reported passing the parked pickup at approximately 12:18 a.m. She noticed the vehicle because it appeared unusually clean for a truck sitting partially on the gravel shoulder. According to her statement, the driver's door remained closed, no interior lights were visible, and no emergency flashers had been activated. Believing the driver might need assistance, she slowed briefly before deciding not to stop because she could see no one outside the vehicle. She continued driving without giving the incident further thought until hearing about the investigation several days later. 17 minutes later, a commercial delivery driver contacted emergency dispatch after observing what he believed was the same pickup approximately 3 miles farther north. Unlike the previous witness, he recalled seeing the driver's side door standing open while the headlights remained off. He reduced speed, expecting someone to emerge from the darkness beside the road, yet no movement appeared anywhere near the truck. Dashboard camera footage from his vehicle confirmed that a pickup had indeed been parked on the shoulder but the grainy nighttime recording failed to capture enough detail for investigators to identify the license plate or determine whether anyone had been nearby. The third report arrived shortly before 1 o'clock from a retired firefighter driving toward Bristol after visiting relatives. His description matched the previous witnesses in almost every respect except for one important detail. He insisted the pickup had been parked facing the opposite direction from normal traffic flow. Initially, investigators believed the witness had simply become disoriented while driving through the mountain curves after midnight. Accident reconstruction specialists later visited the location and determined that his description of the vehicle's orientation accurately matched physical tire marks discovered beside the highway later that morning. Troopers searched the entire section of highway before sunrise without locating the pickup. Instead, investigators found fresh tire impressions leading from the shoulder toward an abandoned gravel access road that had once served a nearby communications tower. The road ended less than half a mile later at a locked security gate overlooking a steep ravine. Officers found no vehicle beyond the gate and no evidence suggesting a truck had turned around within the narrow clearing. Drone surveys conducted after daylight confirmed there were no alternative exits, hidden trails, or recent signs of off-road travel capable of explaining where the pickup had gone. Detectives next examined surveillance footage collected from service stations, convenience stores, and highway cameras covering every possible route leading toward the reported location. Investigators expected to identify the pickup entering or leaving the area within a predictable time frame. Instead, analysts discovered that no camera captured a vehicle matching the witnesses' descriptions after approximately 11:40 p.m. before the first emergency call. Every highway connecting to the remote section had at least one functioning traffic camera, yet none recorded a dark-colored pickup during the period in question. The absence of digital evidence became one of the most difficult aspects of the investigation because it conflicted directly with 3 independent witness accounts and partial dashboard camera footage. Forensic specialists inspected the tire impressions recovered from the gravel shoulder. Measurements indicated a full-size pickup equipped with all-terrain tires, but the tracks ended abruptly where the gravel access road met exposed bedrock near the communications site. Search teams expanded their examination well beyond the immediate area, covering wooded slopes, drainage channels, and abandoned maintenance roads. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging searched throughout the following night, while officers checked nearby storage buildings and isolated cabins. No vehicle matching the descriptions was ever located. Investigators ultimately concluded that the tire impressions confirmed a truck had reached the access road, but offered no evidence explaining how it had left. Several months later, analysts completed a synchronized reconstruction using dispatch logs, vehicle telematics from the delivery truck, dashboard camera timestamps, and the responding trooper's GPS records. The reconstruction revealed an unexpected inconsistency. Based on verified travel times, the 3 motorists could not all have observed the same pickup. According to the timeline, the vehicle would have needed to travel between reported locations faster than physically possible without passing one of the witnesses who had been continuously driving the highway. Investigators carefully reviewed every timestamp multiple times before accepting the conclusion. The reports remained individually credible, yet together they described movements that could not be reconciled. The case was eventually closed after detectives exhausted every investigative lead. No missing vehicles matching the available description were reported anywhere in Tennessee or Virginia during the relevant period. No abandoned pickup was recovered in surrounding counties, and no evidence suggested that the motorists had coordinated their accounts before contacting authorities. The official report classified the incident as an unresolved suspicious circumstance rather than a criminal investigation, noting that insufficient evidence existed to identify either the vehicle or its driver. Among Highway Patrol investigators, however, The case continues to circulate during training discussions because it demonstrates how multiple reliable witness statements can sometimes reinforce one another while simultaneously making a case far more difficult to explain. For travelers who regularly drive isolated Appalachian highways after midnight, it remains one of those investigations where every documented fact appears trustworthy, yet the complete story still refuses to fit together. In this new story, the Carter family had lived in the same narrow Appalachian hollow for nearly 12 years before anything unusual ever happened. Their weathered farmhouse rested between steep forested ridges where sunlight disappeared long before evening reached nearby towns. Only 4 other homes stood within several miles, separated by winding gravel roads and dense hardwood forests that seemed to swallow every sound after sunset. The isolation had always been part of the appeal because the family preferred quiet lives away from crowded highways and expanding suburbs. Neighbors often described the hollow as peaceful, despite its reputation among older residents who quietly admitted they avoided walking those woods after dark. Spring arrived later than expected during that particular year. Cold mornings lingered well into April, leaving thick patches of fog trapped along the valley floor until midday. The Carter family continued their daily routines without noticing anything out of place. David worked maintenance at a nearby lumber mill while his wife Karen managed the property and homeschooled their youngest daughter. Their older son often hunted turkey before sunrise, returning with stories about deer trails, black bears, and distant owls. Nothing in those conversations hinted that the family would soon become the subject of whispered discussions throughout neighboring communities. The first strange incident appeared so ordinary that nobody thought it deserved much attention. Shortly after midnight, one calm Tuesday, Karen woke because someone seemed to be slowly walking across the gravel driveway outside their bedroom window. The footsteps remained steady without rushing or hesitating. She assumed a neighbor needed help with a broken truck because emergencies sometimes happened in remote mountain communities. David pulled aside the curtain, expecting headlights or flashlights. Instead, he found only darkness stretching across the yard beneath a cloud-covered sky. The footsteps stopped the moment he looked outside, leaving complete silence behind. The following evening, everything remained perfectly normal until almost the exact same time. Again, the slow footsteps crossed the driveway. Again, they sounded close enough to identify individual stones shifting beneath heavy boots. David immediately stepped onto the porch carrying a flashlight. The beam reached the tree line without revealing anyone. Fresh dew covered the gravel, yet no footprints appeared anywhere across the driveway. The woods surrounding the farmhouse remained unusually still. Even insects seemed quieter than expected for that season, something David mentioned only after returning indoors. By the end of the week, every member of the family except the youngest daughter had heard the footsteps. Each person described the same deliberate pace. Nobody reported running, stumbling, or changing direction. Whatever produced the sound seemed to walk directly toward the front porch before stopping several feet short of the steps. Then absolute silence followed. The family waited behind darkened windows several nights, hoping to catch whoever might be playing an elaborate prank. No figure ever appeared despite the unmistakable sound approaching the house with remarkable consistency. Weeks passed before another detail entered the story. Their closest neighbor, who lived almost 2 miles away, casually mentioned hearing someone walking outside his barn after midnight. He assumed raccoons had climbed across stored equipment until he noticed the sounds resembled measured human footsteps rather than animal movement. When David described similar experiences, the neighbor grew noticeably uncomfortable. He admitted older relatives once warned him never to investigate unexplained footsteps echoing through mountain hollows during unusually quiet nights. Those warnings came without explanations because previous generations rarely discussed such experiences openly. David dismissed the conversation as local folklore, even though the timing unsettled him. Rural Appalachian communities preserved countless stories passed through families for generations. Most involved cautionary tales meant to keep children away from abandoned mines, unstable cliffs, or unfamiliar strangers. He believed these newer rumors probably served the same purpose. Nevertheless, he installed brighter floodlights around the farmhouse and checked every window before sleeping. The lights illuminated nearly every corner of the property, making it difficult for anyone to approach unnoticed. Despite those changes, the footsteps continued exactly as before. Summer brought warmer temperatures and longer evenings. Friends visited for weekend cookouts, often staying well past sunset. Nothing unusual happened whenever guests remained outside. The strange sounds appeared only after everyone else had left and the family settled into bed. One visitor later remarked that the property felt unusually peaceful compared with neighboring valleys because almost no highway noise reached the hollow. Karen privately wondered whether that silence simply made ordinary nighttime sounds seem more disturbing. She tried convincing herself the explanation was psychological, yet every repeated incident chipped away at that confidence. One humid July night, the pattern unexpectedly changed. Instead of stopping near the porch, the footsteps slowly circled the entire farmhouse. Each family member listened while the unseen walker completed what sounded like a careful inspection around every exterior wall. Wooden boards occasionally creaked beneath invisible weight. Gravel shifted beside basement windows. Dry leaves rustled near the back entrance. David opened the rear door before the sounds reached that side of the house. Nothing stood beneath the floodlights except motionless trees swaying gently in the warm night air. Karen began recording dates and times inside a notebook. She hoped documenting each occurrence might reveal a logical pattern connected to weather, wildlife, or nearby activity. After several months, she noticed most incidents happened during calm evenings without strong wind or rain. The sounds almost never appeared during storms. They also seemed concentrated between midnight and 2 in the morning. Those observations fascinated David because they suggested consistency rather than random imagination. Still, neither explanation nor physical evidence emerged despite careful attention. In this new story, true creepy and scary horror stories from the Appalachian Mountains. In the autumn of 2021, a 24-year-old hiker named Elias Thorne, who worked as a land surveyor, entered the dense timber of the Monongahela National Forest for a weekend trek. He intended to document seasonal soil erosion patterns along the high ridges near the West Virginia border while testing new GPS equipment in deep terrain. Local dispatch logs from that evening indicate that the weather turned abruptly and a thick fog settled over the limestone valleys without any prior warning. Elias was a seasoned outdoorsman who understood the risks of the Appalachian landscape, but he reportedly failed to check in with his emergency contact. Investigators never confirmed if he strayed from the marked path or if the shifting weather conditions simply obscured the familiar landmarks of the trail. According to archive notes from the regional search team, Elias began to experience a series of equipment failures as he reached the higher elevations. The GPS unit displayed conflicting coordinates that suggested he was moving south, while his compass indicated a steady northern heading toward the primary base camp. He eventually decided to set up a temporary shelter near a rocky outcropping because the visibility had dropped to less than 10 feet. State records indicate that several other hikers in the vicinity reported hearing repetitive metallic sounds echoing through the trees during the late hours of the night. Some locals claimed that the sounds were merely the result of wind moving through abandoned mining shafts, but the county file from 2009 suggests otherwise. Elias woke up during the early morning hours to find that his heavy hiking boots had been moved precisely 3 feet away from his tent. There were no footprints in the soft mud surrounding his campsite, and the internal zipper of his tent was still locked from the previous night. He gathered his belongings in total silence while observing that the surrounding forest had become unnaturally quiet, as if the local wildlife had fled. Records conflict regarding the exact path he took to exit the forest, but Elias later stated that he felt a constant presence just behind him. The investigation concluded without finding any evidence of another person in the area, and the case remains a point of ambiguity for the local authorities. The state records from 2022 mention a second individual named Sarah Miller, who was a 32-year-old biologist studying local bat populations. Sarah was stationed in a remote cabin near the Clinch mountain range, where she spent several weeks collecting data on nocturnal migratory patterns. Her logs mention that she discovered several strange markings carved into the trees surrounding her research site during the first week of her stay. She reportedly captured several audio recordings of a voice that seemed to mimic her own vocal patterns from the previous evening. Investigators never confirmed the source of the audio, but the archive notes suggest that Sarah became increasingly paranoid about her immediate surroundings. County files from 2015 describe an incident involving a park ranger named Marcus Reed, who was 45 years old at the time. Marcus was tasked with patrolling the northern boundaries of the Great Smoky Mountains, where several campers had reported seeing flickering lights in the distance. He arrived at a clearing near a decommissioned fire tower and discovered a collection of personal items neatly arranged in a circular pattern. The items included a digital watch and a pair of spectacles that appeared to belong to a missing person from 2012. Dispatch logs indicate that Marcus requested immediate backup after hearing a heavy breathing sound coming from the darkness just beyond his flashlight beam. Some locals claimed that the fire tower was the site of a forgotten settlement, but official state records show no evidence of any historical structures. Marcus reported that he saw a tall figure standing perfectly still near the base of the tower, but the figure vanished when he approached. The county file from 2009 mentions a similar encounter involving a group of hunters who were tracking deer in the same region. These men reportedly abandoned their equipment and fled the area after witnessing a series of blue flashes emanating from the forest floor. Investigators never confirmed the cause of the flashes, and the terrain was later declared off-limits for several months following the incident. A third individual, named James Bennett, was a 50-year-old retired police officer who enjoyed solo camping trips in the Blue Ridge Mountains. In the spring of 2016, he planned a 5-day excursion through a section of the forest known for its treacherous slopes. James was equipped with a high-frequency radio and a detailed map of the region that he had used for over 20 years. Archive notes indicate that he sent a brief transmission on the second night, stating that he had found an unmarked cave entrance. The transmission ended abruptly with a sharp static noise that the dispatch center was unable to filter or identify using standard equipment. Search teams arrived at the coordinates of the cave entrance only to find that the opening had been blocked by a massive rockfall. They discovered James's radio sitting on top of a flat stone, but there was no sign of a struggle or any physical tracks. Records conflict about whether the rockfall was a natural occurrence or if it had been triggered by an external force during the night. Some locals claimed to hear a muffled tapping sound coming from behind the rocks, but the sound was never captured on official recording devices. The state records from 2017 officially closed the case as a tragic accident involving an unforeseen geological event in a remote area. Investigators later discovered a series of photographs on James's camera that depicted a dark corridor lined with what appeared to be rusted metal doors. The photographs were blurry, and the light source was insufficient to provide a clear view of what lay beyond the threshold of the cave. Dispatch logs from that period show that several unauthorized individuals attempted to access the site before it was permanently sealed by the county. The county file from 2009 mentions a local legend about a hidden facility, but no evidence of such a place exists. James remains missing, and the true nature of the unmarked cave entrance continues to be a subject of intense local debate. In the winter of 2018, a 29-year-old geographer named Thomas Vance traveled to the rural outskirts of Kentucky. Thomas was employed by a private environmental firm to map the underground water tables and limestone aquifers hidden beneath the rugged hills. He reportedly established a base camp in a valley that local residents often avoided due to the frequent presence of heavy ground mist. State records from that month indicate that Thomas made several calls to his supervisor regarding anomalous readings on his seismic detection tools. The readings suggested that a large hollow space existed directly beneath his tent, but no known maps indicated any subterranean tunnels. According to dispatch logs, Thomas reported that the ground beneath his feet felt like it was vibrating rhythmically every night at 3 a.m. He decided to document the phenomenon using a high-sensitivity microphone and a series of motion sensors placed around the valley floor. Archived notes show that Thomas recorded a sound that resembled a low-frequency hum that caused structural damage to his electronic gear. Investigators never confirmed the source of the vibration, but the county file from 2009 mentions similar reports from local farmers. Thomas was found 3 days later wandering along a remote logging road in a state of deep confusion and physical exhaustion. He reportedly claimed that he had seen a series of vertical shafts hidden beneath the thick brush that were lined with smooth glass. The state records indicate that Thomas had lost all memory of how he had escaped the valley or where his equipment went. Search crews returned to the campsite, but they discovered that the entire area had been swept clean of any human presence. Even the flattened grass where his tent had stood was now standing upright as if no weight had ever been applied. Records conflict on whether Thomas suffered from a medical episode or if he had encountered an undocumented geographic feature in the hills. What hikers reported deep in the wilderness still doesn't make sense. In late summer of 2011, several unrelated hikers reported nearly identical experiences deep within a remote section of western North Carolina. Their accounts were recorded months apart, yet many details appeared unusually consistent. Dispatch logs, archived ranger notes, and later witness interviews preserved fragments of those reports, though investigators never reached a conclusion that satisfied everyone involved. One of the earliest reports came from Corbin Voss, a 37-year-old survey technician from Tennessee who spent weekends hiking remote trails. He entered the Pisgah region alone during a 3-day backpacking trip and planned to document several abandoned logging routes. According to trail records, he checked in at a ranger station shortly after sunrise and appeared calm before beginning his hike. Weather conditions remained stable throughout the day, and no warnings had been issued for that section of forest. Corbin covered nearly 12 miles before establishing camp near a narrow ridge overlooking a heavily wooded valley. He later stated that nothing unusual occurred until shortly after dusk when distant sounds began echoing through the trees. At first, he assumed another group occupied a nearby campsite, though no fires or lights appeared anywhere below him. The sounds reportedly resembled brief conversations carried by wind, yet every attempt to identify their source failed. Around 10 that evening, Corbin heard what he believed were footsteps approaching from the eastern side of camp. The movement stopped whenever he shined his flashlight toward the trees. Several minutes later, the same pattern repeated from a different direction. He described the experience in a written statement submitted after returning home. According to archive notes, he eventually remained awake until dawn because the sounds continued at irregular intervals. The following morning revealed no obvious explanation. Corbin found no footprints near his campsite, despite damp soil that should have preserved tracks clearly. He also noticed something that later became important during the investigation. Several small stones had been arranged beside the trail leading away from camp. The formation appeared deliberate, though investigators later suggested natural causes could not be ruled out. Corbin photographed the stones before continuing his hike deeper into the wilderness. Approximately 4 months later, a second report emerged from a woman named Tessa Crowley, a 42-year-old physical therapist from Virginia. She visited the same general region while training for a long-distance hiking event. Tessa reportedly knew nothing about Corbin's experience. Nevertheless, her statement contained details that closely matched information contained within county files from earlier reports. Rangers noticed the similarities only after reviewing records during the following year. Tessa spent 2 nights in the forest and described hearing distant voices after dark. She could never distinguish actual words, though the sounds consistently resembled conversations taking place beyond visual range. During her second evening, she reportedly heard footsteps circling her campsite for nearly an hour. Whenever she moved toward the noise, complete silence followed immediately. Investigators later confirmed that no other hikers had registered nearby during that period. The most unusual detail appeared shortly before sunrise. Tessa woke unexpectedly and discovered several stones arranged near a fallen log approximately 30 yards from camp. She later claimed the arrangement had not been present before darkness arrived. Archived ranger notes from 2012 mention photographs taken at the scene, though some records indicate those images were later misplaced. Investigators never confirmed whether the stones had any connection to other reports. As similar accounts accumulated, officials began examining earlier records stored in regional archives. A county file from 2009 referenced a search and rescue volunteer who described hearing distant conversations while assisting during a missing person operation. Another report from 2007 mentioned unexplained footsteps around a temporary camp established by forestry workers. Although details varied, recurring elements appeared often enough to attract attention from local authorities. By 2013, discussions about the reports reached several outdoor organizations operating throughout the Appalachian region. Some members believed environmental conditions created auditory distortions capable of producing convincing illusions. Others pointed toward wildlife activity, arguing that unfamiliar sounds frequently become exaggerated after darkness settles across remote landscapes. Investigators explored both possibilities, yet neither explanation accounted for every detail contained within witness statements. Records conflict regarding several observations, leaving significant gaps in the timeline. One incident from that year generated particular interest. A pair of hikers named Leland Burke and Owen Mercer entered the wilderness for a weekend photography trip. Both men were experienced outdoorsmen who routinely traveled through isolated terrain. According to their statements, they heard voices shortly after sunset while preparing dinner beside a stream. Neither individual could identify specific words, though both agreed the sounds resembled a conversation occurring just beyond sight. Leland later reported seeing a light moving slowly between distant trees across the valley. The light appeared briefly before disappearing behind thick vegetation. Owen claimed he never observed it directly, creating one of several conflicting details found throughout the case. Investigators never confirmed whether another group occupied the area that night. Searches conducted afterward located no campsites, discarded equipment, or evidence suggesting recent human activity nearby. The following morning produced another familiar discovery. Several stones rested beside the trail leading away from their campsite. Unlike previous reports, the arrangement formed a rough line extending toward denser forest. Leland photographed the scene and submitted copies during a later interview. Some locals claimed similar markers occasionally appeared throughout remote sections of the region. Investigators never confirmed those accounts and found little supporting documentation. As years passed, additional reports continued appearing within archive notes and ranger files. Many involved experienced hikers who demonstrated familiarity with wilderness conditions. Most accounts described sounds rather than visual encounters. Voices remained the most common element, followed closely by footsteps approaching campsites after dark. While each report contained differences, enough similarities existed to keep the mystery alive among those familiar with regional records. Researchers examining the case proposed several theories. Certain environmental specialists suggested unusual terrain features might reflect sound across valleys in unexpected ways. Under specific conditions, conversations occurring miles away could reportedly seem much closer than reality, Wildlife experts offered alternative explanations involving nocturnal animals whose calls occasionally resemble human voices. Neither theory addressed the recurring stone arrangements mentioned across multiple reports, separated by years and involving unrelated witnesses. A review conducted during 2019 attempted to organize every available statement into a single timeline. Investigators compared dispatch logs, archived notes, witness interviews, and state records gathered over more than a decade. Their findings revealed no evidence of criminal activity, organized hoaxes, or coordinated fabrication. However, they also failed to identify any explanation capable of connecting every reported detail. Several key documents referenced observations that could no longer be verified because supporting material had disappeared. Today, hikers continue traveling through the same wilderness without incident every year. Most never experience anything unusual and return home with ordinary stories about mountain views and long trails. Yet, scattered among those routine accounts remain a small number of reports that sound remarkably similar to statements recorded years earlier. Investigators never confirmed what caused the voices, the footsteps, or the carefully placed stones. Deep within that section of forest, what several hikers reported still doesn't make sense. In this new story, the Cumberland wilderness went silent, then we heard it. The dense forests of the Cumberland Gap hold a history of strange occurrences that the local authorities rarely discuss. Gideon Thorne had spent nearly 30 years patrolling the deep woods of the Cumberland wilderness near the quiet Kentucky border. The summer of 1997 was the hottest season on record, and the local wildlife had grown very restless. Gideon was 48 years old, and he oversaw a small team of rangers who focused on the southern ridges. His job required him to manage the safety of hikers who often underestimated the complexity of the ancient limestone caves. He carried a heavy radio and a notebook filled with the coordinates of every hidden spring in his large sector. A wildlife researcher named Beckett Sterling arrived at the ranger station during the first week of August to study birds. Beckett was 32 years old, and he specialized in bioacoustics, which is the study of natural forest sounds. He told the ranger he wanted to record the rare owls that lived in a remote valley called Blackwood Hollow. Gideon checked his permits and reminded the young man that the hollow was known for its unusually thick morning fog. Beckett just smiled, and he adjusted the straps on his large pack before heading toward the dark forest trail ahead. The ranger watched the researcher disappear into the tree line, and he felt a familiar weight of concern in chest. The first 5 days of the expedition passed without any major issues, and the weather remained remarkably clear and sunny. Beckett sent a brief radio check-in every evening at exactly 6 o'clock to confirm his location and safety. On the night of August the 6th, the radio remained silent, and Gideon could not reach the young man back. The ranger waited until the following morning before he organized a small search party to head into the Blackwood Hollow. They started their investigation at the last known coordinates that Beckett had provided during his final successful radio check-in. The searchers found the campsite tucked away in a grove of ancient hemlock trees that were covered in thick moss. The tent was still zipped shut, and all of the expensive recording equipment was sitting on a folding wooden table. Gideon noticed that the entire forest was eerily quiet, and not a single bird was singing in the morning light. There were no signs of a struggle, and the food supplies belonging to Beckett were still sealed in plastic bags. The search party expanded their perimeter, but they could not find any footprints or broken branches in the surrounding area. Gideon found a digital recorder that was still running, and he put on the headphones to listen to the print. The audio file started with the normal sounds of the forest, including the wind in the trees and distant owls. At exactly midnight on the recording, the woods went completely silent, as if someone had turned off a giant switch. The silence lasted for nearly 4 hours, and the only sound was the faint hum of the internal electronic components. Then a rhythmic tapping started to echo through the speakers, and it sounded like a person using a heavy hammer. Beckett could be heard whispering into his microphone about a large shadow that was moving through the trees near camp. He described a figure that was at least 8 feet tall, and it moved without making any sound on leaves. The researcher sounded terrified, and he said the creature was mimicking the sound of his own voice back to him, According to the recording, the being stood just outside the tent and it repeated the exact words Beckett spoke. The final entry ended with a loud, metallic screech and the sound of something heavy being dragged across the ground. Gideon felt a chill go down his spine as he realized that the researcher was not alone in Hollow. The search party spent the next 3 days scouring every inch of the valley, but they found absolutely nothing new. Gideon decided to review the archived dispatch logs from the early 1970s to see if this happened before then. He discovered that 3 other researchers had vanished in Blackwood Hollow under the exact same circumstances during the summer months. Each case involved a period of total forest silence, followed by reports of strange voices echoing through the limestone caves. Gideon realized that the hollow acted like a natural echo chamber that could capture and repeat sounds for many years. He returned to the campsite one last time, and he began to tap on the nearby rock walls with shovel. He heard a human voice whisper his name from deep within the stones, and it sounded exactly like Beckett Sterling. The ranger followed the sound toward a narrow opening in the cliff face that was hidden behind a thick waterfall. He squeezed through the gap, and he found himself in a large cavern that was filled with old recording gear. The equipment was decades old, and it had been carefully organized by someone who knew exactly how it all worked. Gideon found a final journal entry from a missing ranger who had disappeared in 1974 near the hollow. The writing described a group of beings who lived in the caves and used sound to hunt their human prey. These creatures could perfectly mimic the voices of loved ones to lure people away from their safe and marked trails. Gideon realized that Beckett had been tricked into following a voice that sounded like a friend calling for help. He saw a pile of bones in the corner of the cave that belonged to many different people, and the ranger managed to escape the cavern just as the rhythmic tapping started to echo through the dark stone walls. He ordered the entire Blackwood Hollow to be sealed off from the public, and he declared it a danger. The official report stated that Beckett Sterling had likely fallen into an unmarked sinkhole during a sudden and violent storm. Gideon knew the truth was much more unsettling because the mountain was still holding the voices of the lost hikers. He retired from the service a year later, and he moved to a quiet town where the ground was. The town of Blackwood tried to move on from the disappearance, but the residents never quite felt safe near the people started locking their doors at night, and they told their children to never repeat what they heard in woods. Gideon Thorne spent his remaining years studying the science of acoustics, and he tried to understand the mountain and its. He kept a copy of the final recording, and he often listened to the way the voice shifted and changed. Some people say that the observers are still out there, and they are still waiting for the next curious hiker. The legends of the Cumberland wilderness continue to grow, and more people report hearing voices in the high mountain air. Every August, the rangers notice an increase in the reports of rhythmic tapping coming from the deep limestone caves. They stay on the lower trails, and they never go into the hollow after the sun has set at. The case remains open in the dusty files of the sheriff's office, but no new evidence has been found. The forest remains thick, and the secrets of the Cumberland Gap are buried deep within the cold gray stone. Gideon often wondered if Beckett was still in the cave, and if he was still calling out for someone. He knew that some mysteries are better left alone in the dark corners of the world, where the wind. The investigation into the recording gear revealed that the machines had been modified with parts that were not commercially available. This discovery suggested that the beings in the caves possessed a high level of technical knowledge about sound and physics. Gideon realized that the creatures were not just animals, but were a highly evolved species that lived in the dark. He spent his final days writing a book about the experience, but he never shared the most terrifying details with. He died in 2024, and he left his collection of audio tapes to the local Historical Society archives. The researchers who studied the tapes found that the voices in the background were actually speaking a very old language. It appeared that the beings had been living in the Cumberland Gap for thousands of years before the settlers arrived. This realization changed the way the community viewed the mountains and the legends that had been told for generations. The mystery of the Cumberland silence remains unsolved, and the files are still locked in the ranger station basement. The town of Blackwood remains a quiet place, but the residents always listen closely when the woods go silent suddenly. They know that the mountain has a memory, and it never forgets a sound that it has heard before. Silas Thorne occasionally visits the old trailhead, and he leaves a small offering of electronics or metal on the rocks. He says it is a way to acknowledge the power of the mountain and its silent and ancient watchers. Some people laugh at him, but others bring their own gifts to the edge of the dark and thick forest. The Hollow seems to accept these items, and the number of disappearances has decreased significantly over the last few years. Beckett Sterling is remembered as a brilliant researcher who pushed the boundaries of what we know about the natural. His family still visits the park every year, but they never go near the valley where he was lost. They stand on the high ridges, and they listen to the wind blowing through the trees of the Cumberland. Sometimes they hear a faint voice on the breeze, but they know better than to follow the sound into. The Appalachian Mountains continue to stand tall, and they keep their secrets hidden beneath the canopy of the green trees. The story of the silent wilderness is a reminder that we are only temporary guests in an ancient world. Gideon Thorne once wrote that the woods do not belong to us, but to the sounds that live within. Every October, the people look at the mountains and they remember the night the Cumberland wilderness went completely and eerily. The final recording Gideon made before he left the service was a simple description of the silence in the forest. He said that the silence was not an absence of sound, but a presence that felt very heavy and dark. He believed that the mountain was a living record of every scream and every laugh that had ever happened. This theory was never proven, but it remains a popular topic among the local hunters and the forest rangers. The tapes from the Hollow are now stored in a specialized vault to prevent any unauthorized people from listening. Many people have tried to find the entrance to the hidden cavern, but the cliffs have shifted over the years. It seems as though the mountain has moved the path to protect its secret from the people who live. Silas Thorne says that some things are not meant to be mapped or understood by those who do not belong. He still patrols the lower trails, but he never goes above the ridgeline after the sun has set. He knows that the observers are still there, and they are still waiting for the next voice too. The legend of the Cumberland Silence is a chilling reminder of the power of the strange and the dark. The mountain remains a silent witness to the history of the land and the people who have passed through. Every year, the fog rolls into the Hollow, and the woods go quiet once again for a long time. In this new story, for more than a century, the mountains of West Virginia have challenged investigators in ways few other places have. Dense forests, abandoned mining roads, isolated valleys, and unpredictable weather have often complicated even the most straightforward investigations. Most missing hikers are eventually found. Most vehicle accidents are reconstructed. Most emergency calls end with reasonable explanations. Yet, every so often, a case emerges that refuses to fit within ordinary investigative methods. One such investigation began during the final weekend of September 2018, when a routine welfare check along an old fire tower road slowly transformed into one of the most perplexing unsolved cases ever handled by a rural sheriff's office. The investigation centered on Black Ridge, a heavily wooded mountain overlooking a small community in Pocahontas County. The ridge was accessible only by a narrow gravel road originally built decades earlier to service a now abandoned fire observation tower. Although hikers occasionally visited the summit during daylight hours, local residents rarely traveled the road after sunset because fallen trees, loose rock, and steep drop-offs made nighttime driving especially dangerous. On the evening of September 29th, a volunteer firefighter contacted the sheriff's office after noticing a blue station wagon parked beside the abandoned tower long after the surrounding recreation area had officially closed. The vehicle's headlights were off, yet its parking lights remained illuminated as though someone intended to return within a few minutes. Deputies arrived shortly before 11 o'clock, expecting to locate campers or photographers watching the stars from the summit. Instead, they found the station wagon completely empty. The keys remained in the ignition, the driver's wallet rested inside the center console, and a folded hiking map lay open across the passenger seat. The vehicle showed no signs of mechanical failure, recent collision damage, or forced entry. More unusually, investigators discovered a thermos of coffee that was still warm enough to suggest its owner had left the vehicle only a short time before deputies arrived. The surrounding silence seemed ordinary for a mountain after dark, yet the complete absence of any nearby person immediately raised concerns that the driver might have suffered a medical emergency somewhere along the ridge. Search teams assembled before midnight and began working outward from the abandoned vehicle. Experienced tracking dogs quickly identified a scent leading away from the parking area toward the remains of the old fire tower. Investigators followed the trail across a narrow footpath covered with fallen leaves before reaching the tower's concrete foundation, where the dogs unexpectedly stopped. Handlers attempted several restarts from different directions, but every effort ended at exactly the same location. Beyond the foundation, neither dogs nor searchers located additional evidence indicating where the missing individual had gone. Fresh rain earlier that afternoon had softened the soil surrounding the summit, yet investigators found only one continuous set of footprints leading from the vehicle to the tower. No return tracks appeared anywhere nearby. At first daylight, the search expanded dramatically. State police helicopters equipped with thermal imaging scanned the surrounding mountains, while volunteer rescue teams divided the forest into carefully measured grid sections. Rangers familiar with the terrain searched abandoned logging trails, rock outcrops, and drainage channels where an injured hiker might have become trapped. Mine safety officials inspected several collapsed entrances located miles away, despite little evidence suggesting the missing person had traveled that far. By the end of the third day, more than 100 volunteers had searched nearly 2,000 acres without locating a single additional clue. The only confirmed evidence remained the station wagon, the footprints ending at the fire tower, and the unanswered question of why no trace continued beyond that point. Investigators soon identified the vehicle's owner as 51-year-old Thomas Granger, an amateur landscape photographer from Elkins who frequently spent weekends documenting remote Appalachian overlooks. Family members described him as meticulous, experienced outdoors, and deeply familiar with the region's mountain roads. Camera equipment recovered from the vehicle contained dozens of photographs taken throughout the afternoon, beginning with rivers, abandoned barns, and autumn forests, before ending with several images of the fire tower shortly before sunset. Nothing in the photographs suggested danger or unusual activity. Analysts carefully reviewed every image, enlarging reflections inside windows, shadows between trees, and distant ridgelines. No unidentified people, vehicles, or wildlife appeared in any frame. Digital evidence offered little additional guidance. Granger's mobile phone last connected to a nearby cellular tower at 8:47 p.m. before losing reception, an expected occurrence given the mountainous terrain. GPS information extracted from his camera confirmed he had remained near the summit throughout the evening. His credit cards showed no activity after purchasing fuel nearly 3 hours earlier, while bank records revealed no unusual financial transactions before his disappearance. Detectives considered the possibility that he had intentionally left the area on foot, but his backpack, flashlight, cold weather jacket, and overnight supplies all remained inside the vehicle. Friends later remarked that Granger never explored unfamiliar trails without carrying at least basic emergency equipment. On the sixth day of the investigation, a forestry employee made a discovery that briefly renewed hope. Less than half a mile from the abandoned fire tower, searchers located Granger's camera lens cap resting beside a moss-covered boulder overlooking a steep valley. The item showed no weather damage despite several days of rain, suggesting it had not been lying there since the initial search began. Detectives immediately returned to the area, expecting to uncover additional evidence. Intensive searches lasting another 48 hours produced nothing else. Forensic testing confirmed the lens cap belonged to Granger's camera, yet investigators could not determine how it reached a location that had already been searched repeatedly by trained personnel. Months later, after active search operations had concluded, detectives completed a final reconstruction of Granger's known movements. Every verified fact supported a simple timeline until the moment he left his vehicle. After that point, the evidence became increasingly difficult to reconcile. The footprints clearly demonstrated he walked toward the abandoned fire tower. The tracking dogs independently confirmed the same route. The photographs established that he had remained calm only minutes earlier. Yet no physical evidence explained how an experienced outdoorsman disappeared from an exposed mountain summit without leaving behind additional tracks, discarded equipment, signs of injury, or indications that another person had been present. The case remains officially open today as an unresolved missing person investigation. Every few years, advances in forensic technology prompt investigators to re-examine the physical evidence preserved from the original search, hoping overlooked details might finally connect the missing pieces of the timeline. So far, none have. Among retired deputies and volunteer rescuers who spent long days combing the forests of Black Ridge, the investigation is remembered not because of what they found, but because of what they never did. In a place where rain preserves footprints, experienced search teams rarely miss obvious evidence, and mountain trails usually tell a clear story. One ordinary autumn evening ended with a trail that simply stopped. For those who worked the case, that unfinished path remains one of the most haunting unsolved stories ever to emerge from the mountains of West Virginia. In this new story, witnesses still can't explain these ghost encounters. In November of 2012, a remote forestry station near Greenwater, Washington, became the focus of an unresolved investigation. Local authorities received multiple contradictory statements from experienced wilderness professionals who encountered something they simply could not identify on the mountain. Mark Vance was a 34-year-old wildlife biologist who spent weeks tracking nocturnal animal populations across the dense Pacific Northwest Territory. He shared a temporary field cabin with Sarah Jenkins, a 28-year-old forestry technician who mapped severe trail erosion there. According to archive notes, their primary objective was purely scientific and required them to remain outdoors during late-night hours. The environment was notoriously challenging because thick fog frequently rolled through the valley, drastically reducing visibility for anyone in the woods. On the night of November 14, Mark set up motion-activated trail cameras along a deeply isolated ridgeline. Official dispatch logs later confirmed that his radio communication suddenly ceased at exactly 11:45 in the evening that night. Sarah remained at the base cabin, but reportedly noticed an unusual drop in voltage that caused all their electronics to flicker. She attempted to contact him several times, but the radio emitted nothing except a steady, high-pitched static sound instead. State records indicate that weather conditions were completely clear at the base station, which ruled out immediate storm interference entirely. Up on the ridge, Mark reportedly observed a dark silhouette standing completely motionless near one of his newly positioned cameras. He assumed it was a local hiker, so he called out a loud warning about the steep drop-off ahead of them. The figure did not respond to his voice, but it moved backward into the heavy brush with remarkable, silent speed. When Mark walked over to investigate the specific area, he found absolutely no footprints left behind in the damp mud. This detail was particularly baffling because the soil was very soft, meaning any human presence would definitely leave deep impressions. He recovered the camera unit and immediately returned to the base station to review the digital images with Sarah. The county file from 2009 detailed a similar incident where equipment failed, but these current photographs showed something else. The first 3 frames captured a completely blank trail, yet the 4th frame contained a bizarre, distorted visual anomaly. A pale shape was visible beneath the tree line, but its outlines were completely blurred due to unexplained light refraction. Investigators never confirmed if this distortion was caused by a faulty lens mechanism or an actual physical object passing by. Some locals claimed the area was historically prone to unusual magnetic variations that frequently disrupted electronic recording devices there. However, Sarah noticed that the temperature sensors on the camera logged an immediate drop of 20 degrees within 1 minute. The official regional weather data completely contradicted this finding, showing a perfectly stable climate across the entire mountain range. Records conflict regarding whether this brief localized freeze was an environmental anomaly or simply an instrumentation error by the team. The next morning, the two researchers decided to examine the ridge together during the clear daylight hours to find answers. They discovered that several heavy branches near the camera site were cleanly snapped off at a height of 8 feet. No heavy machinery operated in that protected zone, and wildlife officials confirmed no large animals matched that specific damage pattern. Furthermore, the broken wood fibers appeared completely dehydrated, which was highly unusual given the constant dampness of the rainforest. A nearby park ranger later filed an auxiliary report stating he heard low-frequency humming throughout the previous night. By the afternoon, the local sheriff department dispatched a single officer to conduct a routine check of the area. The responding deputy noted that both scientists seemed highly credible and showed no signs of panic or mutual deception. He searched the perimeter for evidence of unauthorized trespassers, but his search yielded absolutely no physical evidence of intruders. The official report concluded that an unknown animal or transient hiker likely caused the disturbance on the ridgeline. However, the file remains open today because several technical contradictions in the equipment logs were never fully explained by experts. Independent analysts don't agree on the actual source of the extreme temperature drops recorded by the field equipment. Some experts believe that a localized thermal inversion occurred, while others maintain that the digital sensor simply experienced a malfunction. We can't definitely prove either theory because the original camera unit was later lost during a routine transport to town. The case remains one of the most unusual mysteries in the region, leaving both witnesses without any clear answers. The strange things that happened during those June nights. Deep within the heavy, humid swamps of southern Louisiana, an isolated botanical expedition encountered something entirely unexplained. During the sweltering hot summer of 2017, two highly dedicated researchers established a remote camp. What they recorded over 3 continuous, terrifying nights remains a highly contested mystery among local authorities today. Archived notes from their official state investigation reveal a disturbing timeline that defies simple, logical, scientific explanation. Mark was a 32-year-old professional field botanist tasked with documenting rare endangered swamp orchids. His capable working partner was a 29-year-old highly experienced wildlife photographer named Lisa. Their primary scientific objective required them to camp deep inside the remote bayou away from established trails. The official county file from 2009 mentioned highly unusual animal migration patterns throughout that region. They safely arrived on June 12th and immediately began setting up their heavy equipment near dark water. The first quiet night passed without any significant dangerous incidents as the thoroughly exhausted researchers slept soundly. State records confirm that severe scattered thunderstorms unexpectedly bypassed their specific location despite highly ominous weather predictions. However, Lisa woke up shortly after midnight because she heard strange, heavy splashing sounds near the bank. She initially assumed a curious large alligator was investigating their sealed waterproof containers near the muddy shore. When she cautiously shined her heavy flashlight outside, the heavy splashing sounds instantly ceased in the darkness. Mark quickly discovered a series of massive, deep indentations in the damp soil the following humid morning. The strange, deep tracks were vaguely humanoid in shape, but they sank nearly 4 inches into mud. Some locals claimed a rogue commercial trapping outfit operated illegally nearby, but investigators never confirmed those rumors. Mark carefully photographed the bizarre muddy footprints and noted that the stride length indicated a tall creature. He calmly rationalized that rapidly rising swamp water might have dangerously distorted ordinary wild animal tracks overnight. The highly stressful situation escalated drastically during their second dark night when an awful chemical smell arrived. Reportedly, the foul, suffocating odor resembled rotting meat mixed heavily with the sharp scent of raw sulfur. Both dedicated researchers immediately woke up, coughing violently and struggling to breathe properly inside their small tents. Lisa quickly grabbed her emergency satellite radio to call for immediate outside assistance, but only received static. Dispatch logs show no emergency distress calls were ever successfully recorded by the regional ranger station then. Suddenly, a massive, unseen heavy force violently shook the solid ground and collapsed the aluminum tent frame. Mark scrambled frantically into the dark open clearing and desperately aimed his high-powered thermal imaging camera. The glowing digital screen instantly revealed an enormous, intense heat signature standing perfectly still behind a cypress. The strange, glowing thermal image lacked any discernible biological features and completely blocked the ambient background radiation. Records conflict regarding exactly how long they silently watched the imposing bright anomaly before it slowly retreated. Morning light quickly revealed that their specialized digital navigation equipment was completely shattered into tiny, useless pieces. Mark frantically insisted they absolutely needed to abandon their remaining camping gear and hike toward the highway. Lisa completely agreed, but they soon realized their backup analog compasses were displaying erratic magnetic directional headings. They were effectively hopelessly lost in a massive, unforgiving wilderness region known for disorienting, highly experienced survivalists. The desperate, anxious botanists decided to blindly follow the slow river current, hoping it intersected a road. They hiked for 12 grueling, painful hours through thick, thorny underbrush while constantly feeling intensely directly watched. Archived notes from Lisa stated she repeatedly caught brief, terrifying glimpses of pale, smooth objects moving swiftly. Every single time she abruptly stopped to point out the hidden observer, the pale, unknown shapes vanished. Utter physical exhaustion eventually forced them to establish a completely vulnerable, unprotected makeshift camp by the water. They huddled tightly together by a small, warm fire while clutching their sturdy walking sticks for protection. Around 2 in the morning, the surrounding dark, dense woods suddenly fell dead silent as insects stopped. A deep, guttural, mechanical humming sound slowly began to vibrate through the damp dirt beneath their boots. Some locals claimed strange underground natural gas releases occasionally plagued the region, but geologists found no evidence. Mark frantically scanned the pitch-black distant tree line with his thermal camera, but the battery exploded. Lisa screamed loudly in absolute terror when a tall, pale, smooth shape casually stepped into the firelight. The towering, featureless, pale entity did not aggressively attack them, but simply stood motionless, staring blankly ahead. Mark slowly reached for his heavy orange flare gun, but his frozen, numb fingers were trembling violently. The bizarre, towering, unknown creature emitted another deep, deafening, humming vocalization that violently extinguished the campfire flames. Plunged into total suffocating pitch darkness, the two terrified close friends blindly ran into the treacherous swamp. They hopelessly sprinted blindly through the dense, tangled brush until they eventually separated from each other forever. A commercial swamp airboat tour operator miraculously found Lisa wandering aimlessly near a designated access channel. The young, traumatized photographer was severely dehydrated and suffering from multiple minor lacerations caused by sharp branches. State records confirm she was immediately transported to a local regional medical hospital and strictly treated. When heavily armed police deputies eventually navigated back to retrieve the abandoned campsite, they discovered sheer chaos. The heavy, durable canvas tents were completely melted into toxic puddles, and all metal hand tools twisted. Mark was tragically never seen again, despite the massive coordinated regional search effort spanning 3 adjacent parishes. Highly trained search dogs completely lost his distinct individual scent trail near the edge of a deep bog. Law enforcement officials strongly suspected the blindly fleeing botanist accidentally fell into the massive dark deep sinkhole. However, they could not logically, realistically explain how the heavy camping equipment was melted by extreme temperatures. The overwhelming putrid atmospheric sulfur smell and the localized underground ground vibrations also remained completely, totally unsolved. Lisa completely permanently abandoned her promising wildlife photography career and moved to a bustling, noisy urban city. She completely, absolutely refused to conduct any further public media interviews regarding her terrifying, unexplainable swamp experiences. She eventually quietly wrote a highly obscure anonymous internet blog detailing her intense, lingering psychological mental trauma. Reportedly, she deeply suffered from severe chronic daily insomnia and constant terrifying nightmares featuring tall, faceless entities. Dispatch logs routinely show she frequently called local urban police authorities complaining about strange, heavy mechanical vibrations. The deep, dark Louisiana swamps remain mostly completely uncharted and deeply thoroughly feared by many veteran guides. Experienced local boat tour operators actively, aggressively discourage overly ambitious amateur novice tourists from exploring that bayou. Official public records conflict regarding the actual total accurate number of missing persons cases linked to wilderness. Some ambitious, independent amateur internet investigators occasionally dangerously venture into the region, hoping to finally capture evidence. Most of them always return completely empty-handed, while a few others emerge with deeply unsettling stories. The absolute total lack of any definitive, hard physical evidence heavily continually frustrates those who believe Lisa. The destroyed, shattered thermal camera conveniently completely erased any potential digital visual proof of the giant signature. Vociferous internet skeptics constantly loudly argue that sheer blind panic and total darkness easily transformed a bear. Archive notes carefully gathered from the official police investigation confidently concluded that an undocumented toxic gas leaked. Yet, the exact, specific, true origin nature of those massive, perfectly smooth footprints remains a contested topic. University biology experts quickly, easily dismiss the crazy, ridiculous idea of a completely unknown massive swamp animal. They firmly, constantly argue that an active, healthy breeding population of large, hidden creatures would leave evidence. No unusual animal hair samples or strange skeletal bone remains have ever been definitively, positively, conclusively linked. Some locals claimed the federal national government quietly, aggressively suppressed the actual truth to secretly protect operations. Official government investigators never confirmed any grand illegal conspiracy and simply permanently closed the bizarre swamp case. For 20 years, nobody entered this Appalachian cabin. Deep in the dense wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains, an abandoned cabin sat completely undisturbed for 2 decades. During the early spring of 2020, a determined property appraiser finally unlocked the heavy front door. What he discovered inside the dusty, rotting structure remains a highly debated topic among regional law enforcement today. Archive notes from the subsequent state police investigation describe a highly disturbing scene that defies simple logical explanation. 45-year-old Robert Hayes worked as a highly experienced municipal property appraiser for the rural county. His primary professional objective required him to evaluate abandoned, secluded estates for upcoming public tax auction property sales. The county file from 2009 mentioned a highly unstable structural foundation regarding this specific isolated property. He safely arrived on April 4th and immediately began carefully assessing the severely overgrown exterior of the structure. The first hour of his standard inspection passed entirely without any significant dangerous incidents or unexpected safety hazards. State records confirm the regional weather forecast predicted clear skies and moderate temperatures for that entire calm afternoon. However, Robert distinctly heard strange, heavy dragging sounds echoing slowly from the upper floor of the abandoned cabin. He initially assumed a large wild animal was aggressively building a nesting den inside the warm, dry attic. When he cautiously shouted a loud verbal warning, the heavy dragging sounds instantly ceased in the dusty darkness. Robert quickly discovered a highly bizarre set of massive, deep indentations on the original hardwood floor completely inside. The strange, unexplainable tracks were perfectly smooth in shape, and they pressed heavily into the solid oak planks. Some locals claimed a rogue drifter occasionally used the abandoned structure to hide stolen heavy commercial mining equipment. Investigators never confirmed those specific, wild, unsubstantiated rumors and firmly maintained the property was completely securely locked prior. Robert carefully photographed the bizarre, smooth floor damage and noted the stride length indicated a massive, heavy object. The highly stressful situation escalated drastically when an awful chemical smell suddenly arrived continuously throughout the entire floor. Reportedly, the foul, suffocating odor tightly resembled burning synthetic plastic, mixed heavily with the sharp scent of sulfur. The dedicated appraiser immediately started coughing violently and aggressively struggling to breathe properly inside the completely sealed room. Robert quickly grabbed his portable emergency radio to call for immediate outside medical assistance, but only received static. Dispatch logs show no emergency distress calls were ever successfully officially recorded by the regional sheriff that day. Suddenly, a massive, unseen, heavy physical force violently shook the solid foundation and partially collapsed the wooden staircase. Robert scrambled frantically toward the dark open hallway and desperately aimed his high-powered flashlight toward the ceiling. The glowing beam instantly revealed an enormous, intense, dark mass standing perfectly still near the broken attic hatch. The strange, dark anomaly lacked any discernible biological features and completely blocked the normal ambient light filtering indoors. Records conflict regarding exactly how long he silently, terrifyingly watched the imposing tall anomaly before it slowly retreated. Afternoon light quickly clearly revealed that his specialized digital measurement equipment was completely shattered into tiny, useless pieces. Robert frantically, urgently decided he absolutely needed to abandon his remaining inspection gear and hike toward his truck. He soon realized his reliable backup analog compass was constantly displaying completely erratic, unexplainable, heavy magnetic directional headings. He was effectively completely disoriented inside a massive, unforgiving wilderness region known for permanently confusing, highly experienced outdoorsmen. The desperate, anxious appraiser decided to blindly, consistently follow the overgrown driveway path, hoping it safely intersected pavement. He hiked for 2 grueling, painful hours through thick, thorny underbrush while constantly feeling intensely, directly, violently watched. Archived notes from Robert stated he repeatedly caught brief, terrifying glimpses of pale, smooth, large objects moving swiftly. Every single time he abruptly stopped to firmly point out the hidden observer, the pale, unknown shapes vanished. Utter physical, mental exhaustion eventually heavily forced him to quickly establish a completely vulnerable, unprotected rest stop briefly. He huddled tightly, safely against a large oak tree while strongly clutching his sturdy walking stick for protection. Around late afternoon, the surrounding dark, dense woods suddenly fell, totally dead silent, as wild birds completely stopped. A deep, guttural, mechanical humming sound slowly, continuously began to violently vibrate through the damp dirt beneath him. Some locals claimed strange underground natural gas releases occasionally plagued the Appalachian region, but geologists officially found nothing. Robert frantically, aggressively scanned the pitch-black distant tree line with his heavy flashlight, but the battery died. He screamed out loudly in absolute sheer, unadulterated terror when a tall, pale, smooth shape casually stepped forward. The towering, featureless, pale entity did not overtly, aggressively attack him, but simply stood motionless, completely staring blankly. Robert slowly, hesitantly reached for his heavy orange safety whistle, but his frozen, numb fingers were constantly trembling. The bizarre, towering, unknown creature emitted another deep, deafening, humming vocalization that violently, instantly rattled his internal chest. Plunged into total, suffocating, pitch-black panic, the terrified appraiser blindly, frantically ran into the treacherous, dense woods. He hopelessly, blindly sprinted continuously through the thick, tangled brush until he eventually physically collapsed near the highway. A commercial delivery truck driver miraculously happily found Robert wandering aimlessly near a heavily designated rural gravel shoulder. The older traumatized appraiser was severely badly dehydrated and suffering from multiple minor bleeding lacerations caused by branches. State records confirm he was quickly, safely, immediately transported to a local regional medical hospital and strictly treated. When heavily armed local police deputies eventually carefully navigated back to retrieve the abandoned property, they discovered chaos. The heavy, durable wooden cabin doors were entirely melted into toxic puddles and all metal hinges twisted. The intense subsequent official police investigation failed to produce any logical, rational, scientific answers regarding the strange destruction. Law enforcement officials strongly, firmly suspected a highly aggressive local squatter had simply violently rigged the deserted property. However, they absolutely could not logically, realistically explain how the heavy wooden framing was completely melted by temperatures. The overwhelming, putrid atmospheric sulfur smell and the highly localized underground ground vibrations also strictly remained completely unsolved. Robert permanently fully abandoned his promising county property appraisal career and rapidly moved to a bustling, noisy city. He completely, absolutely, strictly refused to conduct any further public media interviews regarding his terrifying, unexplainable cabin experiences. He eventually, quietly, safely wrote a highly obscure, completely anonymous internet blog detailing his intense, lingering, severe trauma. Reportedly, he deeply severely suffered from chronic, daily heavy insomnia and constant, terrifying nightmares featuring tall, smooth entities. Dispatch logs regularly show he frequently, frantically called local urban police authorities, continually complaining about heavy vibrations. The actual, true, physical nature of what currently securely resides deep inside that rugged Appalachian cabin remains unspoken. In this news story, most visitors entered Appalachia expecting breathtaking overlooks, quiet rivers, and endless forests painted with brilliant autumn colors. They planned scenic drives through mountain passes where every curve revealed another postcard view. Few realized those same roads carried generations of stories that never appeared in travel brochures. Long before highways connected distant towns, narrow mountain routes linked isolated communities that depended entirely on one another. Families remembered every bridge, every abandoned church, and every forgotten cemetery hidden among the ridges. Some roads eventually gained quiet reputations that locals rarely discussed with strangers. The warnings usually arrived as simple advice rather than dramatic ghost stories. Older residents suggested reaching the next town before sunset or choosing the longer highway instead of certain backroads. They almost never explained why. For most travelers, those conversations sounded like ordinary mountain folklore. Only years later did some realize they had unknowingly driven through places where unexplained experiences had been reported for generations. One autumn evening, the Harris family began what they believed would become another unforgettable drive through the Appalachian Mountains. Mark Harris enjoyed photographing abandoned structures, while his wife Jennifer preferred documenting forgotten churches, one-room schoolhouses, and historic cemeteries scattered throughout rural valleys. Their teenage son Ethan spent most trips recording video for a travel channel dedicated to overlooked destinations across America. They had already crossed thousands of miles without experiencing anything stranger than unexpected wildlife crossing the road. Careful planning, reliable equipment, and years of experience convinced them they understood mountain travel better than most tourists. Nothing suggested this journey would become the only trip they refused to repeat. Their route followed a collection of state highways winding through remote sections of eastern Appalachia, where towns sometimes stood nearly 40 miles apart. Cellular reception faded shortly after leaving the interstate. Paper maps replaced navigation apps because the surrounding mountains frequently interrupted satellite signals. The family welcomed the isolation. Modern distractions disappeared almost immediately, leaving only forests stretching endlessly beyond both sides of the pavement. Occasional wooden signs pointed toward communities with populations smaller than a single city block elsewhere in the country. Weather remained perfect throughout the afternoon. Blue skies reflected across narrow rivers flowing beside the highway, while cool mountain air drifted through open windows, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. Shortly before sunset, they stopped at a family-owned diner overlooking a small valley. Local residents filled nearly every table despite the quiet weekday evening. Conversations centered around hunting season, changing weather, and roads damaged during previous winters. When Mark casually mentioned their planned route across an older mountain highway, several conversations briefly stopped before continuing as though nothing had happened. Their waitress hesitated only long enough to ask whether they intended driving that road after dark. Mark answered yes, because the next motel remained less than 90 miles away. She nodded politely before recommending they leave immediately rather than waiting for dessert. Her tone carried concern instead of fear, making the advice strangely memorable. The highway narrowed within minutes after leaving town. Fresh pavement gradually gave way to older asphalt, patched repeatedly over decades. Guardrails disappeared along several steep curves overlooking valleys that vanished beneath growing darkness. Dense hardwood forests pressed tightly against both sides of the road until branches formed a tunnel overhead. Traffic became almost non-existent. During nearly 40 minutes, they encountered only one pickup truck traveling in the opposite direction. Its driver briefly flashed headlights twice before disappearing around the next bend. Jennifer assumed the signal warned about deer farther ahead. Ethan continued filming through the windshield, hoping to capture the fading evening light filtering between towering ridges. Darkness arrived much faster than expected beneath the forest canopy. Mark switched to high beams, revealing countless tree trunks standing like silent walls only a few feet beyond the pavement. Fog slowly gathered inside low valleys before drifting upward across the highway. Visibility remained acceptable, yet every curve looked strangely similar to the previous one. Ethan eventually lowered his camera after noticing something unusual. Mile markers seemed inconsistent. Marker 63 appeared first, followed several minutes later by marker 61. Another curve revealed marker 64 again. Mark assumed he had simply misread them while concentrating on the winding road. Ethan replayed his recording and quietly confirmed the numbers appeared exactly as remembered. Jennifer unfolded their paper map beneath the interior light. According to the route, they should have reached a small crossroads community nearly 15 minutes earlier. Instead, the forest continued uninterrupted in every direction. No driveways appeared, no mailboxes stood beside the pavement, even electrical lines seemed to vanish beyond the last ridge they crossed. The silence outside gradually became noticeable. Normally, mountain roads echoed with insects, distant streams, or occasional owls. Here, the surrounding forest appeared completely still, despite gentle wind moving across the higher slopes. When Mark lowered his window for several seconds, he heard nothing except the steady hum of the engine. Another 20 minutes passed before headlights illuminated an old white church standing beside the road. A narrow cemetery surrounded the building behind a weathered iron fence leaning noticeably toward the hillside. Jennifer asked whether they could stop for photographs the following morning because moonlight gave the place an unusual appearance. Mark slowed slightly but continued driving. Less than 10 minutes later, Ethan looked up from his camera and quietly asked why they were passing the same church again. Nobody answered immediately. The identical leaning fence, cracked front steps, and broken stained glass window stood exactly where they had appeared before. Mark insisted another church probably resembled the first one because many rural congregations used nearly identical architecture. Ethan remained unconvinced after comparing both video clips side by side. The family finally reached a narrow bridge crossing a shallow creek. Beside the entrance stood an old wooden warning sign faded almost beyond recognition. Jennifer noticed a distinctive lightning-shaped crack running through one corner of the board. 15 minutes later, another bridge appeared. The same crack marked another weathered sign, standing in exactly the same position. Ethan searched his earlier footage again before quietly showing the screen to his parents. Every knot in the wood matched perfectly. Even missing paint formed identical patterns. Mark felt the first genuine wave of uncertainty since entering the mountains. He checked the odometer. According to the vehicle, they had traveled nearly 60 additional miles, yet every landmark suggested otherwise. Concern slowly replaced curiosity. Mark attempted turning onto the first side road they encountered, hoping it would reconnect with another highway. Less than 5 minutes later, the narrow lane curved unexpectedly before returning to the same main road from the opposite direction. The old bridge stood ahead once again. Jennifer suggested consulting a compass stored inside the glove compartment. The needle refused to settle in one direction, drifting slowly before stopping, then turning again without obvious reason. Ethan tried restarting his phone, even though no signal remained available. The digital map loaded briefly before displaying their location several counties away, then disappeared completely. None of the devices agreed with one another. Shortly after midnight, another vehicle finally appeared behind them. Relief spread through the family until Jennifer noticed something unsettling. The headlights never seemed to grow closer, despite following for nearly 15 minutes. They remained the same distance back through every curve, occasionally disappearing behind hills before returning exactly where they had been before. Mark reduced speed, hoping the driver would pass. The lights slowed as well. He accelerated slightly. They matched his pace again without gaining or falling farther behind. Ethan filmed through the rear window until the headlights vanished completely while rounding one sharp bend. The road behind them remained empty for miles afterward. Nearly an hour later, they reached a small gas station illuminated by a single fluorescent light. Relief quickly turned into confusion after discovering the pumps covered with rust and weeds growing through cracked concrete. Dust coated every window. The building had obviously been abandoned for years. Jennifer later recalled feeling certain she had seen the lights glowing from nearly a mile away, yet no electrical service appeared connected anywhere on the property. Ethan photographed the station before they continued driving. The digital timestamps on every image later showed conflicting times despite being taken only seconds apart. Some indicated photographs captured before they entered the highway, while others appeared almost 2 hours into the future. No explanation ever accounted for the corrupted sequence. The highway finally emerged from the mountains shortly before dawn. A larger state road appeared ahead, along with the first passing traffic they had seen in hours. They stopped at a convenience store where the cashier immediately asked whether they had spent the night on the old mountain route. Without describing their experience, Mark simply nodded. The cashier quietly explained that travelers occasionally arrived exhausted after believing they had driven in circles despite following the same highway. Most blamed heavy fog, unfamiliar terrain, or fatigue. Others refused, discussing the experience altogether. Local law enforcement had investigated numerous reports over the years, yet found no damaged signs, missing intersections, or roadway defects capable of explaining why unrelated visitors described remarkably similar experiences separated by decades. Back home, the Harris family reviewed every photograph, map, and video collected during the trip. Mileage records, timestamps, and recorded landmarks refused to fit into any logical sequence. Nothing proved anything supernatural had occurred. Mountain roads, exhaustion, changing weather, and human perception could easily combine in unexpected ways. Researchers studying navigation errors have long documented how isolated environments distort distance, direction, and memory, especially after dark. Even so, one detail remained impossible for the family to ignore. Ethan's continuous dashboard recording showed the same weathered church appearing twice without any visible turnaround, intersection, or break in the journey. Every attempt to retrace the route months later failed because neither the church nor the abandoned gas station could be located where maps indicated they should have been. Today, the family still visits Appalachia, but they never travel unfamiliar mountain roads after sunset. Whenever someone asks why, they simply recommend reaching the next town before dark, repeating the same quiet advice once offered to them without explanation. The unmarked road, hidden deep in Appalachia. Deep in the heavily forested Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, a lost driver experienced a completely unexplainable, terrifying event. During the bitter winter of 2020, a dedicated commercial trucker encountered something that defies basic, logical, scientific explanation. What local authorities eventually uncovered completely destroyed the quiet, peaceful illusion of that specific, dark, rural mountain community forever. Archived notes from the massive official investigation describe a highly disturbing timeline of events that still haunts state police today. 42-year-old Arthur Pendleton worked as a dedicated commercial transport driver, simply trying to finish his route. His isolated route forced him through a highly outdated rural mountainous region located miles away from any major modern interstates. His primary daily objective required him to safely deliver heavy industrial equipment completely alone during the long, dark winter nights. The county file from 2009 actually mentioned several highly unusual missing traveler cases originating from that exact region. Arthur arrived on November 12th and immediately began carefully navigating the icy, narrow roads while listening to the quiet radio. The first quiet, freezing hours passed entirely without any significant dangerous incidents, as the exhausted driver cautiously navigated sharp turns. State records confirm that severe, scattered winter storms unexpectedly bypassed their specific elevation despite highly ominous regional weather forecast predictions. However, Arthur stopped his massive truck shortly after midnight because he clearly saw a massive fallen tree blocking the highway. He initially assumed a severe winter windstorm had aggressively knocked the massive dead pine completely across the designated rural road. When he cautiously looked directly at his digital navigation map, he noticed a highly obscure, unmarked dirt bypass road nearby. Arthur aggressively turned his heavy commercial vehicle onto the unpaved path, hoping to safely bypass the massive, solid wooden obstruction. The highly stressful situation escalated drastically during that dark hour when an awful chemical smell suddenly arrived continuously inside there. Reportedly, the foul, suffocating odor tightly resembled burning synthetic plastic, mixed heavily with the sharp scent of raw industrial sulfur. The isolated, terrified driver immediately started coughing violently and aggressively struggling to breathe properly inside the completely sealed truck cabin. Arthur quickly grabbed his portable emergency radio to call for immediate outside medical assistance, but only received loud, aggressive static. Dispatch logs show no emergency distress calls were ever successfully officially recorded by the regional sheriff department during that night. Suddenly, a massive, unseen, heavy physical force violently shook the solid dirt foundation and violently rattled the thick truck windows. Arthur scrambled frantically behind the heavy wooden steering wheel and desperately aimed his high-powered security flashlight toward the trees. The glowing beam instantly revealed an enormous, intense, dark mass standing perfectly still directly behind the parked commercial delivery truck. The strange dark anomaly lacked any discernible biological features and completely blocked the normal bright ambient light from the moon. Records conflict regarding exactly how long he silently, terrifyingly watched the imposing tall anomaly before it slowly, finally, silently retreated. Arthur frantically, urgently insisted he absolutely needed to completely abandon the dangerous dirt road and aggressively reverse his heavy vehicle. He completely strongly pushed the heavy transmission lever, but he soon realized the main electrical engine panel was displaying sparks. He was effectively hopelessly trapped inside a massive, unforgiving wilderness region known for permanently disorienting, highly experienced commercial delivery drivers. The desperate, anxious driver decided to blindly, violently run toward the back, hoping to retrieve his heavy defensive metal tools. He confidently, blindly sprinted continuously through the freezing dark dirt road until he eventually physically discovered massive, strange, deep tracks. Arthur remained entirely, completely, silently hidden behind the thick, solid metal trailer while intensely listening for any sudden, aggressive movements. Archived notes from Arthur stated he repeatedly caught brief, terrifying glimpses of pale, smooth, large objects moving swiftly near trees. Every single time he abruptly, cautiously raised his head to firmly point out the hidden observer, the pale shapes vanished. Utter physical mental exhaustion eventually heavily forced him to quickly, carefully establish a completely vulnerable, unprotected defensive position down low. He huddled tightly safely against the heavy metal tires while strongly clutching a heavy steel wrench for absolutely necessary protection. Around 2 in the freezing morning, the surrounding dark, dense woods suddenly fell, totally dead silent as freezing winds stopped. A deep, guttural, mechanical humming sound slowly, continuously began to violently vibrate through the damp dirt beneath the rubber tires. Some locals claimed strange underground natural gas releases occasionally plagued the Appalachian region, but geologists officially formally found zero evidence. Arthur frantically, aggressively scanned the pitch-black distant tree line with his heavy flashlight, but the expensive digital battery died. He silently screamed internally in absolute, sheer, unadulterated terror when a tall, pale, smooth shape casually stepped near the vehicle. The towering, featureless, pale entity did not overtly, aggressively attack the reinforced metal, but simply stood motionless, completely staring blankly. Arthur slowly, hesitantly gripped his heavy steel wrench tightly, but his frozen, numb fingers were constantly, heavily trembling, extremely violently. The bizarre, towering, unknown creature emitted another deep, deafening, humming vocalization that violently, instantly, completely shattered the thick truck windows. Plunged into total, suffocating, pitch-black darkness outside the truck, the terrified driver blindly, frantically crawled toward the deep brush. He hopelessly, blindly waited continuously inside the highly secure, hidden, thorny bush until the early morning sunlight eventually safely arrived. A commercial timber delivery operator miraculously happily found the rural vehicle completely abandoned near the heavily designated gravel access channel. The highly traumatized young driver was severely, badly dehydrated and suffering from multiple minor bleeding lacerations caused by broken glass. State records confirm he was quickly, safely, immediately transported to a local regional medical hospital and strictly treated for shock. When heavily armed local police deputies eventually carefully, safely navigated back to retrieve the abandoned truck, they discovered sheer chaos. The heavy, durable steel vehicle doors were completely, entirely melted into toxic puddles, and all metal engine components were twisted. Arthur was tragically completely unable to mentally process his terrifying experience despite the massive, highly coordinated regional psychological support presence. Highly trained tracking search dogs completely, entirely lost any distinct individual scent trails near the steep edge of the woods. Law enforcement officials strongly, firmly suspected the blindly, quickly fleeing driver accidentally entirely hallucinated the terrifying, massive, deep, dark entity. However, they absolutely could not logically, realistically explain how the heavy steel doors were completely melted by extreme high temperatures. The overwhelming, putrid atmospheric sulfur smell and the highly localized underground ground vibrations also strictly remained completely, totally, officially unsolved. Arthur completely, permanently, fully abandoned his promising commercial transport delivery plans and rapidly moved to a bustling, noisy, populated city. He completely, absolutely, strictly refused to conduct any further public media interviews regarding his terrifying, unexplainable, deep, dark road experiences. He eventually, quietly, safely wrote a highly obscure, completely anonymous internet blog detailing his intense, lingering, severe, heavy psychological trauma. Reportedly, he deeply, severely suffered from chronic daily heavy insomnia and constant terrifying nightmares featuring tall, faceless, smooth, looming entities. Dispatch logs routinely regularly show he frequently frantically called local urban police authorities, continually complaining about strange, heavy mechanical vibrations. The deep, dark, isolated, unmarked mountain road remains mostly completely thoroughly abandoned and deeply heavily feared by many local residents. Experienced local rural highway patrolmen actively, aggressively, strictly discourage overly ambitious amateur novice drivers from widely exploring that specific acreage. Official public state records conflict regarding the actual, total, highly accurate number of missing traveler cases strictly linked to wilderness. Some ambitious, independent amateur internet investigators occasionally dangerously completely venture into the dark, unmarked road, hoping to finally capture evidence. Most of them always safely return completely empty-handed, while a few others quickly emerge with deeply unsettling, disturbing stories. The absolute, total, complete lack of any definitive, hard physical evidence heavily, continually, profoundly frustrates those who genuinely believe Arthur. The completely destroyed internal security cameras conveniently, completely, permanently erased any potential digital visual proof of the giant outside entity. Vociferous internet online skeptics constantly, loudly, aggressively argue that sheer blind panic and total utter darkness easily successfully transformed reality. Archive notes carefully, thoroughly gathered from the official local police investigation confidently, strictly concluded that an undocumented toxic gas leaked. Yet the exact, highly specific, true physical origin nature of those massive, perfectly smooth circular tracks remains completely officially contested. University biology science experts quickly, easily, permanently dismiss the crazy, ridiculous, bizarre idea of a completely unknown, massive humanoid animal. They firmly, constantly, strongly argue that an active, healthy, massive breeding population of large, hidden creatures would leave physical evidence. No unusual animal organic hair samples or strange skeletal biological bone remains have ever been definitively, positively, completely, conclusively linked. Some locals claimed the federal, national, centralized government quietly, aggressively, permanently suppressed the actual truth to secretly protect classified operations. Investigators never confirmed any grand, illegal, hidden conspiracy and simply, safely, permanently, officially closed the bizarre, terrifying, unmarked road case. Arthur constantly refuses to leave his secure concrete urban apartment whenever the winter season finally slowly descends upon the city. He strictly violently demands that every single heavy deadbolt lock remains securely fastened throughout the entire duration of the night. The actual, absolute, terrifying truth hiding deep within those ancient, desolate Appalachian mountains might never be completely fully understood logically. Perhaps some dense, dark, forgotten regions of the deep American wilderness are genuinely meant to remain completely, entirely undiscovered forever.